They said the fall was an accident, but the truth, like the watch left ticking 5 minutes fast, ran quietly, just out of sync. In a world of polished lies and courtroom silences, one misread minute nearly sealed a woman's fate. And someone knew it. Someone watched, and someone killed precisely. This is a story of time, its illusions, its betrayals, and the man who listens not to clocks but to contradictions. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. There's a theory, I don't say it's mine, but I don't disown it either, that in New York, nobody's ever really late. They're just waiting for time to catch up with them. The city's full of clocks, loud ones and discreet ones, all politely disagreeing with each other, in a place where a 5-minute delay can cost $1 million contract and a 1-minute lead can save a man's life. You'd think folks would get a little more humble about their wristwatches. They don't. From my chair by the office window, where I'm usually parked when not chasing someone who doesn't want to be caught. I'd seen people sprint down 35th Street as if the sidewalk were on fire and the second hand of the world was chasing them. But I've also seen a man stand dead still for 10 minutes, just to pretend he hadn't been waiting. Time here is elastic. People twist it, trim it, and stretch it, mostly to make themselves look innocent. I bring this up because of what happened at 3:17 on a Thursday afternoon, a moment that hit our front door like a metronome with a badge. It was the moment we met Miss Gloria Vance, and it started, as many things do around here, with Fritz. "Archie," Fritz called up from the hall. "A Miss Vancey." She is precisely on time. Fritz doesn't usually editorialize. If a woman is early, he says she's early. If she's late, he says she's delayed. But precisely on time? That was a detail worth cocking an eyebrow at. I glanced at the clock on Wolfe's desk. The minute hand had just swept past the 17. Wolfe, across from me in the red chair with the arms that sag under his weight and his certainty, did not glance up from the book in his lap. Which meant I was elected to handle whatever this Miss Vance had brought with her, be it a question, a case, or calamity. When a woman times her arrival to the minute, she's either meticulous or terrified. And in this town there isn't much daylight between the two. She was tall, composed, and wearing grey, the kind of grey that doesn't try to be noticed and succeeds by failing. Her gloves were still on, though she'd removed her coat with a kind of absent efficiency, and her purse never left her hand. She stepped into the office like she was afraid to leave a footprint. "Miss Gloria Vance," she said, as if reciting from an old script. "Thank you for seeing me." Wolfe didn't lift his eyes from the letters of Marcus Aurelius, which wasn't a great start. So I took the cue. "Miss Vance," I said, "what can we do for you? Preferably without standing, bleeding, or subpoenaing." "I need Mr. Wolfe to confirm that I did not witness a murder," she replied. Her tone was polished porcelain, uncracked, but liable to chip. "I've been accused of seeing something I didn't see. At a time, I wasn't there, and I'm afraid I can't prove otherwise." That got Wolfe's eyes up, though only about a third of the way. He regarded her over the top of the book as one might regard an oyster, curious, cautious, and mildly inconvenienced. "My sister, Delia, fell from her apartment window 2 nights ago," she said. "5th floor, Upper East Side. The police called it an accident, and that was acceptable. Painful, but acceptable. We weren't close. We weren't anything recently." Her voice thinned a little there, but she caught herself, the way women do when they remember they're in a room where weakness might be noted. "The problem," she continued, "is that someone insists they saw me at her window at the moment it happened, which is absurd. I wasn't there. I was across town, but I can't prove it. Not yet. And I'm being watched. I don't know by whom, but the insinuations have started." Wolfe set the book down with the weight of a man shelving civilization. "What exactly do you wish me to do?" he asked, voice like a linen napkin folded too sharply. You assert that you did not witness a death. Do you believe that can be proven? I believe, she said carefully, that someone is trying to build a lie out of one precise minute. That was when I saw Wolfe's fingers twitch, ever so slightly, on the armrest. I'm told, she said, that the time of my supposed appearance at Delia's window was exactly 3:17 p.m. That's what the man across the street says, the one with the telescope. He's quite confident about it. Her lips tightened around that last line, like it tasted sour. I don't own a watch, she added, and yet I'm being framed by one. There was a stillness in the room then. Not the quiet of thought, but the kind Wolfe cultivates when his disdain is thickening. Time, he believes, is the world's most misused instrument. To invoke it falsely, to try and wield it as proof without precision, is something he considers indecent. Miss Vance, to her credit, seemed to sense that. She looked at Wolfe and said, I came here because you're the only man I've heard of who might care whether a second is accurate. Wolfe, as always, said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence is never empty. You assume, Wolfe said finally, that I can be persuaded by melodrama and punctuality. A poor assumption. He reached for the book again, dusting its cover with 2 fingers as if brushing off a cobweb of interest. I do not investigate the absence of events, he continued. If you were not at the window, if you did not see your sister fall, then the matter is settled, or would be were this a world ruled by logic. It is not. It is ruled by suspicion, idiocy, and the insatiable need to believe the worst of one another. Miss Vance stood straighter. You won't help me. I do not chase phantoms. Mr. Goodwin will see you out. She didn't flinch, but I saw the sharp breath she took. Her hand tightened on the strap of her bag, and in that little motion there was more emotion than in all her speech. I led her to the door, gently. She didn't look back. I was halfway back to my desk when Wolfe spoke, not to me, not exactly, more to the room, or the atmosphere, or the orchid that had begun to bloom a touch too early. Lies, he said, are tolerable. They are currency, but a precise lie, a lie that claims the dignity of a time stamp, that is vulgar. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He leaned forward, peered at the clock on the wall and frowned. I do not care, he murmured, for the manipulation of minutes, especially by fools who cannot measure them. Which meant, of course, that something about Miss Vance's 3:17 had struck him. Not deeply, not yet. But it had struck. I resumed my seat by the window, notebook in hand, but didn't write anything. I didn't need to. The clock ticked on. Wolfe apparently had stopped ignoring it. When I made my way up to Delia Vance's apartment building, a cream-coloured affair with doorman in gold braid and gossip in linen gloves, I was greeted with the sort of warm hostility New Yorkers reserve for other New Yorkers asking questions, the kind that says, I'm listening because I'm bored, not because I care. The neighbours had plenty to offer. One thought Delia was quiet but tense, which in Manhattan might mean anything, from jazz musician to blackmailer. Another swore she had a cat. There was no cat. No one had heard a scream, naturally. Screams in these parts are like car alarms. They go off so often they've ceased to matter. What struck me was how eager they all were to tell me something, and how little of it fit. They agreed on the time, or roughly, but not on the sounds, the mood, the lights. It was as if the event had echoed more loudly after it happened than during. Upstairs, the window from which Delia had fallen yawned open like a guilty mouth. But the story? That was still locked tight. Freddie Marsh lived in the building across the street, 6th floor, facing west. His apartment smelled faintly of old oranges and newspaper ink, and his idea of decor involved a broken globe and a stack of pulp novels. Freddie fancied himself a poet, but judging by the typewriter ribbon and the dust on the keys, the muse had skipped town around 1949. What Freddie did have was a telescope on a tripod pointed directly at Delia's window. I was looking at the sunset, he said, gesturing vaguely at the east-facing glass. The light's good around then. Golden. Reflects." He leaned in, his eyes bright with mischief or madness, hard to tell which. "I saw her, Mr. Goodwin, a woman, at the window, standing perfectly still, at exactly 3:17 p.m. I checked my watch." "Was she looking down?" I asked. "She was looking out," he said, "like she wanted to see the whole city, or make sure someone was watching her." I let the silence settle. It always did, more than a question. Freddie's story had the peculiar flaw of being too smooth. He didn't search for words, didn't pause to remember. His phrasing had the well-worn polish of something tested on multiple ears, and when I asked him to repeat it, just to see if the timeline still fit, he gave me the same lines verbatim, down to the exact minute and the angle of the sun. Truth, when it's real, comes with friction. Freddie's was frictionless, according to the building's part-time manager, who was either chronically curious or just short on hobbies. The Vance sisters hadn't been close in years. "They had a falling out over a trust fund," he said. "Delia thought Gloria was squandering it. Gloria thought Delia was hiding it. Typical family affection. Money, blood, and a long silence. The holy trinity of motive. Apparently they'd seen each other the week before the fall. It had not ended in hugs. The name Carl Lebrun came up not from the neighbours, but from a secretary in the downstairs mailroom who mentioned, with just enough hesitation to imply danger, that Delia had worked for some fancy legal guy who always talks like he's reading from a contract. Carl Lebrun, Esquire. Senior partner in a firm that prided itself on discretion and resolved lawsuits before anyone had to open their mouth in court. He wasn't in Delia's building the day she died, but his name hovered like perfume, or gunpowder. The law office was 3 blocks east in a suite with too much glass and not enough daylight. Emily Thorne greeted me with the poise of someone who fields inquiries all day and files half of them away in her head for later use. She had dark eyes and careful diction, and her blouse didn't wrinkle, which in my experience is always a sign of danger or dry cleaning. "Delia worked here for 3 years, she said. She kept to herself, but she was efficient." "Had she been in any trouble?" I asked. "I wouldn't know," she replied, which usually means I definitely know. "She did stay late sometimes." "How late?" Emily's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Long enough to miss the early train, not long enough to call it overtime." I made a note, not in my book, but in my head. I was already halfway to the door when Emily said it, as if it had slipped out of her coat pocket. "Sometimes," she said, "she came back. After hours, when the office was locked." I turned. "Why?" She shook her head. "She never told me, but I saw her through the glass once, from the street, lights on, alone." The way she said alone had layers, 1 part worry, 1 part doubt, 1 part fear. I didn't press, not then. But I marked it down inside, a private door, swinging open in a locked building, and a woman returning to something she might have left behind, too late. That night I was back at the brownstone, halfway through a glass of milk and a column on international graft, when the call came in. Emily Thorne had been found on the floor of her apartment. Not dead, not yet, but bruised and unconscious. The police said it looked like a robbery. I said it looked like panic. Kramer had already been by. His voice on the phone was the usual blend of gravel and grudge. "If you and Wolfe have something, now's the time," he growled. "We don't," I said. "But someone clearly thinks we do." I hung up and turned to Wolfe, who was, naturally, unimpressed. "Mere escalation," he said. "Panic is the surest signal that truth is close at hand." I didn't answer. I was already thinking of the woman in the window, the sister in the dark, and the shadow that had followed Emily home. Janowitz Timepieces was the sort of shop you could walk past 100 times without noticing. The window display featured 3 tired wristwatches on faded velvet, and a tin sign that hadn't been repainted since Roosevelt's first term. The first Roosevelt. Inside it smelled of metal filings, cheap lacquer, and something older and less agreeable. The man behind the counter wore spectacles thick enough to double as defense mechanisms and had the jawline of someone who chewed glass recreationally. "Mr. Janowitz?" I asked, though the odds of it being anyone else were slim. He gave me a grunt, which in horologist circles might have passed for hospitality. "I'm here on behalf of Nero Wolfe," I added. That earned me a glare, not quite hostile, but somewhere in the same neighborhood. "I'm not interested," he said. "You might be," I replied, "depending on how you feel about your ex-wife being accused of murder." That got his attention. Not because he was concerned for her, but because the idea seemed to amuse him. "She's clever," he said, pouring tea from a small, scorched kettle behind the counter, "but not clever enough to keep her lies on schedule." "She says she was here," I told him, "at 3:17 p.m., day before yesterday." He gave a sharp laugh, bitter enough to sweeten the tea. "She wasn't." "You're sure?" "I run a business, not a soup kitchen. I know who walks through that door." He didn't just deny it, he relished denying it, like Gloria had not merely tried to borrow time, but steal it. "She's building something," he said, "out of nothing, and using my name for the scaffolding." There was no hesitation in his voice. But something about the certainty rang too clean, too ready. I went back the next morning to press him. Maybe he needed a little more incentive or a little less arrogance. The bell above the door gave its usual dry cough as I stepped in. No answer. I called his name once, twice. Nothing. Behind the counter, the back door was ajar. I knocked, then pushed gently. He was slumped in a chair at his workbench, cup in hand, mouth slightly open. A magnifying loupe lay on the floor beside him like a lost monocle. The tea kettle on the hot plate was still warm. There were no signs of struggle, but the color of his face, greyish, with a hint of something greener, didn't argue for natural causes. I backed out and made the call. Poison, the coroner would later say. Fast-acting, tasteless. So was murder in this case. While we waited for the crime scene boys, I took a look around, gently, respectfully, and with the professional eye of someone who knows where secrets get scribbled. The work ledger sat open on his desk, neat columns, firm handwriting, job numbers, dates. The entry for Tuesday had a curious blank. From 3 to 3:30, torn out, a perfect rectangle of absence, not erased, not crossed out, removed, deliberately. That was the window, Gloria claimed, and someone had decided it shouldn't be remembered. Kramer arrived an hour later, trailing 2 detectives and the scent of half-burnt cigar. His mood was foul, which is to say, unchanged. "You again?" he said to me. "What is this? Some kind of hobby?" "Occupational hazard," I replied. "Wolfe's interested." "That's the first bad sign." He moved through the shop like a man inspecting termites. I gave him the short version. Gloria, the alibi, the torn ledger, the poison. He absorbed it with a grimace, then levelled a look. "Tell Wolfe to keep out of it." I nodded, knowing full well what Wolfe would do with that suggestion. "He's not fond of time being tampered with," I said. "Especially when it gets people killed." Kramer didn't answer. He was already scowling at the ledger, as if he could pull the missing page back with pure rage. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, a glass of beer untouched, and a look on his face that suggested the world had disappointed him yet again. I gave him the details. He listened, eyes closed, fingers steepled. "Murder," he said finally, "is often clumsy. But this is delicate. Someone killed a man to erase a minute." "Gloria's minute," I said. "Perhaps, or someone else's. The trouble, Archie, is that time is rarely a reliable witness. It slips, it drifts, it lies." He opened his eyes and looked at me. And yet in this case, someone believed it precise enough to kill over. His tone carried no outrage, only curiosity, the only emotion he permitted more than once a day. That night I found him in the office, seated between the French mantel clock and the old brass carriage clock from the upstairs hall. He was studying them like they might confess. "They're both wrong," he said, not looking up. "This one runs fast, that one's slow. Neither has been adjusted in weeks." I didn't argue. I've long accepted that Wolfe prefers his clocks like his clients. Inconsistent until proven otherwise. "Yet we believe in time as though it were law," he muttered, "even as it betrays us." I waited. I knew what came next. He reached for the phone and dialed with 2 fingers, as if each number offended him. "Saul," he said when it picked up. "Carl Lebron, quietly, 2 days. I want to know where he eats, when he lies, and to whom." He hung up without a farewell, which in Wolfe's world is the highest compliment. He turned to me, not fully, just enough to imply I might be worth addressing. "There's a second woman," he said. "Find her." No elaboration, no explanation. But I've heard that tone before. It meant the frame had widened, and something, or someone, no one had mentioned was already part of the picture. Freddie Marsh lived in an apartment that had clearly been decorated by neglect and furnished by coincidence, the kind of place where ashtrays outnumbered chairs and the one valuable object, a long brass telescope angled through the window, looked like it had more mileage on it than its owner. I had followed him that afternoon with the casual interest of a man tailing a duck who thought he was an eagle. Freddie had a poet's gait and a hustler's eyes, and as he made his rounds between a payphone, a newsstand, and a corner deli where he didn't buy anything, I began to suspect he was in the business of looking more than living. Back at his apartment, he told me he collected moments, which turned out to mean he sold them. Names, shapes, shadows. Who went in where, when they came out, and what color their shoes were when they did. "You'd be amazed what people will pay to know what other people do when they think they're alone," Freddie said, with a grin that had too many teeth for its own confidence. I wasn't amazed, I was irritated and suspicious. Freddie was proud of his profession, which was unfortunate, since it wasn't really a profession, just an addiction to ambiguity wrapped in a monthly check from a gossip sheet that rhymed sleaze with society. "I've spotted mayors with dancers, wives with chauffeurs, lawyers with each other's wives," he said. "Of course, some of it you have to fill in. The camera can only see so much." It wasn't exactly perjury, it was performance. Freddie didn't need to lie outright, he just provided the outline and let imagination do the inking. What made him useful also made him dangerous. He saw too much, remembered selectively, and edited reality for resale. And that made him a very bad witness, and a very good target. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was finishing a plate of Fritz's pickled beets and rereading Tacitus in the original Latin, which is his version of casual relaxation. Saul arrived 10 minutes later, hat in hand and expression neutral, which meant something unpleasant was coming. "Carl Lebron's been seen with Raymond Sayer," Saul reported. "Twice in the last week. Midtown clubs, no lawyers present, private booths." I frowned. "Sayer? The currency laundering trial?" "Same one," Saul said. "Company shell collapsed last month. Millions evaporated. SEC's sniffing around." Wolfe gave a grunt, which, for him, was equal parts confirmation and insult. "If Lebron is entangled in financial deceit," he said, "it adds a layer of necessity to Delia's demise." "A layer?" I asked. He closed the book. "No man kills for air, but money is as good a motive as vengeance, and much more reliable." It clicked then, not all at once, but enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. Delia Vance, quiet secretary and competent typist, had worked for Carl Lebron long enough to know where the bodies were filed, and perhaps one document too many had crossed her desk. If she'd seen something, flagged it, or even hinted that she had questions, that would have been enough. Men like Lebron didn't like loose ends. Delia had been, quite literally, removed. It wasn't certain yet. But in Wolfe's house it never needed to be, until it did. I was still putting together a sentence with the words embezzlement, dead secretary, and blackmail when the doorbell rang and Fritz summoned me with his usual calm urgency. Miss Gloria Vance had returned, unannounced, unguarded, and visibly frayed at the edges. Her gloves were crumpled in one hand, and in the other she held a manila envelope with the grip of someone who'd already imagined the worst inside. "I received this," she said without preamble, handing it to me. Inside was a single black and white photo. A fifth-story window, a blurry female figure. "I don't know where it came from," Gloria said, voice taut. "It was in my mailbox this morning. No note, no return address." I passed it to Wolfe. He took it gingerly, as if it were already smudged with guilt. "It looks like me," she added. "But I wasn't there." Wolfe didn't answer. He didn't need to, not yet. Wolfe held the photograph between his fingers like it offended him. "It is indistinct," he said. "The shape could be anyone. The blouse, the hair. Suggestive, not definitive." He turned it slowly. "There is no time stamp, no indication of when it was taken, and if I'm not mistaken, no proof that the window is even Delia's." "Freddie said it was 3:17, I offered. Wolfe sniffed. "Freddie also sees trysts in rain shadows. He is a professional fantasist." Gloria sat stiff in her chair, eyes forward. "But someone wants this to be real," Wolfe continued, "and that is more telling than whether it is." He set the photo down, as if it no longer deserved to be part of the conversation. For Wolfe, there are few crimes worse than those committed without elegance. Murder is tolerable if it is intelligent. Blackmail, forgivable if ingenious. But this is vulgar, he said, a crime dependent on the tyranny of minutes. It relies not on truth, but on the assumption that everyone is too busy to look twice at a clock. Gloria stirred. "You think it's fabricated?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that the photograph is intended not to inform, but to frighten, and that is the province of cowards." His voice was like a whetted blade, slow, sharp, and gleaming with intent. The call came through at 9 that evening, from a beat cop I knew, by reputation, and owed a favour. "Your poet's dead," he said, bludgeoned. "Apartment, beside his telescope." Freddie Marsh, purveyor of gossip and patron saint of half-truths, had seen something he shouldn't, or claimed he had, and someone had decided his viewing privileges were revoked. "Who found him?" I asked. "Neighbour. Said she heard a crash, nothing stolen." That was all it took. Wolfe didn't ask for more. "He talked," Wolfe said, "or threatened to. Someone silenced him." I didn't argue. Outside, the city went on blinking. Inside, we were getting closer to something that didn't want to be seen. Nero Wolfe, having finally conceded that something stank more than Fritz's Limburger, issued the command without looking up from the book he wasn't reading. "Take Mr. Panzer and go," he said. "There are angles to be measured." Now, Wolfe issuing marching orders is like a whale asking for a flight plan, but this wasn't about exercise, it was about what he called empirical contradiction, which is Wolfe's way of saying someone's fibbing, and not very cleverly. Freddie Marsh had given a time, 3:17, and a claim, that he saw Gloria Vance at Delia's window. Wolfe, who wouldn't cross the room to save a drowning man without first changing into slippers, suddenly found it worthwhile to know precisely how the sun landed on a fifth-floor apartment window, and what a man with a telescope might see from 60 feet and 4 panes away. So Saul and I packed measuring tape, a map of the block, a compass, a stopwatch, and a sour mood, mine, and stepped out. Wolfe remained in his chair, of course, surrounded by orchids and disapproval. He didn't say hurry, he didn't have to. In Wolfe's world, truth is best served fresh. We started on the opposite curb, where Freddie's window opened like a blind eye into a building that had too many stories and too few witnesses. The sun was just high enough to throw a reflection across Delia's fifth-floor unit, but only for a few minutes at a time. Saul marked angles while I stood in the crosswalk, stopwatch in hand, timing how long light sat on the brick face before shifting. 2 minutes and 19 seconds, to be precise. We tried it again. The difference was 7 seconds thanks to a cloud and a delivery truck that parked illegally and refused to leave. City life, never submits to science. "What do you think?" I asked Saul. "I think Freddie could have seen someone," he replied, "but only if he was looking, and only if the figure stood still. And if his clock was right," I added. Saul said nothing, but I saw the edge of a grin. Clocks, as we were learning, didn't much care for honesty. By the time we left, I had half a page of notes and a full tank of skepticism. Freddie's story was accurate only if time held still. It didn't. The doorman at Delia's building had the face of a man who had seen too many tenants, too few tips, and had concluded that truth was best delivered in vague outlines. When I asked if he remembered seeing Gloria Vance that day, he squinted upward, as if the ceiling might help. "Miss Vance?" he repeated, drawing it out like a crossword clue. "Yes, she came by." "Before or after the fall?" "After," he said, certain. "Police were already here. Yellow tape, people milling. She looked distressed." "Not guilty?" "No," he said. "Just too late." I nodded and left him to polish the brass on the front door. He seemed to like jobs that kept his hands busy and his thoughts elsewhere. Gloria had been there that day, just not when it mattered. The clock was ticking, but not in the way we'd been told. I was already halfway out the door when something snagged the corner of my eye. A clock. It was perched above the front desk, a fat brass thing with Roman numerals and a second hand that limped. At first, I ignored it. Then I checked my wristwatch. I frowned, then checked again. 7 minutes. The lobby clock was exactly 7 minutes slow. I waited 30 seconds in case the thing just liked to catch its breath, but no. It trudged on, unbothered by the discrepancy. 7 minutes isn't much unless you're trying to solve a murder, timed down to the second. Suddenly Freddie's 3:17 wasn't 3:17 anymore. Saul and I sat in the car with the engine off and the city humming around us. I stared at my notes, then at my watch, then back at the building. The math wasn't difficult. Freddie's testimony was locked to a time, 3:17. But if his reference point, the lobby clock, was slow, then everything that followed it was crooked. "Subtract 7 minutes," I said. "Freddie saw someone at 3:10. Saul nodded. "Which means?" "Which means Gloria couldn't have been there. She wasn't." We sat a moment longer. The city went about its lies, and I started to feel the edges of something shifting. Not a conclusion, but a crease forming in the fabric of the story. Small, silent, dangerous. Time was unraveling, and with it, a lie. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to the correction like a priest receiving new scripture. He didn't smile. Wolfe never smiles. But he let his fingers tap once on the arm of the chair. "At 3:10, I said, "Freddie sees a woman. But the lobby clock is off. Gloria shows up after the police. She never stood at that window." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. It was one of those rare moments when a lie collapses neatly like a souffle under thunder. Gloria had told the truth, and someone else, had crafted a timeline to undo it. Wolfe sat motionless, eyes half-lidded, as if digesting more than Fritz's duck pâté. "This is the fulcrum," he said. "The fixed point on which the affair pivots. Someone built a lie from the minute hand outward, confident that no one would question its direction." He opened his eyes. "Now the deception has failed. Time has betrayed its master." "You ready to move?" I asked, out of habit. He closed his eyes again. "Not yet." The door crashed open in that special Kramer way, like subtlety had been outlawed and no one had told him. He had the kind of face that made warrants look like accusations and paperwork feel personal. He held the paper up like a bad hand in poker. "She's under arrest." "On what?" Wolfe asked without rising. "Eyewitness, timeline, motive, photograph." "The usual trifecta of error," Wolfe said. Kramer didn't flinch. "I'm not here to argue. She goes in. You want her out? Prove it." He turned to me. "Goodwin." "Yes, sir?" "You're too quiet. Trying something new, I said. He left without a word. Wolfe didn't move, but the air in the room did. It doesn't happen often. When it does, you feel it like a temperature shift in your bones. Wolfe stood. No dramatics, no grunting. Just a single, deliberate motion. A bear lifting from its den, ready not to strike, but to render judgment. He looked at me, then toward the door where Kramer had gone. "You will inform him," Wolfe said coldly, "that he has once again mistaken timing for truth. He has arrested the wrong woman. Again." I didn't ask what changed his mind. I already knew. When Wolfe decides the stage is set, it's never subtle. There's no overture, no trumpet, just a sentence shaped like a subpoena. "Archie," he said that morning, "we shall require a convergence. Wolfe doesn't like people in his house unless they are dead, bearing food, or absolutely necessary." This was the third. "Carl Lebrun, Emily Thorne, Gloria Vance, and Kramer," he said, counting them off like courses in a meal he didn't plan to enjoy. I paused at the last name. "Kramer? Of course," he said. "He must bear witness, or else he will reconstruct events out of spite and cigars." So I made the calls, pulled the strings, and nudged the egos. Gloria agreed with restrained dread. Emily asked no questions. Carl sent a secretary to confirm his arrival. Kramer didn't respond, but he showed up, which in his world is a compliment. Wolfe, as usual, didn't shift from his chair all day. He waited, lips pursed, mind moving with that silent, brutal precision that makes men like Carl nervous before they know why. And when the room was full and every chair occupied except his, Wolfe raised his eyes and said, "We shall begin." He didn't say with whom, but we all knew. Carl Lebrun wore a suit the color of courtroom ash and the smile of a man accustomed to redirecting facts mid-sentence. He entered our office with the smooth assurance of someone who's been paid handsomely for being unwelcome and yet indispensable. He sat without waiting to be invited. Not rudeness, just habit. Men like Lebrun live in rooms where chairs and questions are always arranged for them. "I've been told," he began, "that this is about the death of my former assistant. I do hope this isn't a rehearsal for accusation." Wolfe regarded him as if he were a variation in temperature. "Hope," he said, "is a sentiment often offered when one fears that knowledge is near." I could tell Carl didn't like that. Not because he reacted, but because he didn't. Stillness, in lawyers, is defense. Wolfe's questions began simply. Delia's hours, her access, her duties. Carl answered in tones lacquered with legality. She was discreet, competent, and entirely forgettable. Until Wolfe's questions curled inward, Delia's after-hours visits, the confidentiality clauses, her access to sensitive files. The lacquer began to lift. Carl crossed one leg, then uncrossed it. Wolfe noticed. Of course he did. And we weren't done yet. Wolfe gestured, not dramatically, just deliberately, and I handed him the envelope. He drew the photograph out with 2 fingers, held it up to the light, and then extended it to Carl. "You recognize this?" he asked. Carl's eyes narrowed. "It appears to be a woman at a window." "It was sent anonymously," Wolfe said, "to Miss Vance." Intended, no doubt, to suggest her guilt. Carl smiled, but only with his mouth. "It's not especially clear." "No," Wolfe agreed, "yet you flinched." It was subtle. A tightening at the corner of the eye, a flicker of calculation too quick to cancel. Carl recovered instantly, smoothing the line of his jaw. "I'm a lawyer, Mr. Wolfe. I flinch at anything suggestive without proof." Wolfe returned the photo to the envelope. "Indeed. Which is why you should be very afraid." Wolfe's voice took on that edge, not sharp, but surgical. "Miss Delia Vance," he said, "discovered an irregularity in a settlement document you had buried 6 months ago, a discrepancy in disbursement tied to a defunct holding company whose trail leads to Raymond Sayer." Carl did not answer. "She confronted you. Perhaps she asked questions. Perhaps she made no threat at all, merely left the implication that she had kept a copy. What she intended is immaterial. You believed she had leverage. Carl blinked, just once. Wolfe continued, and for a man like you, whose career is built on discretion, that was intolerable. No one spoke. Emily Thorne's hands were folded so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. Gloria sat still, gaze fixed forward, as if holding a breath she hadn't earned. Wolfe let the silence bloom. Then, "She didn't fall. She was pushed." And the next name on his tongue would be the one that mattered. Wolfe turned his head slightly, not far, but enough to make Carl aware the line of inquiry had changed course. "Freddie Marsh," Wolfe said, with the disdain of a man naming a beetle, "lived across the alley. His apartment faced Miss Vance's. His reputation was one of marginal prose and maximal interference." Carl blinked. "I don't know the man." "You knew of him," Wolfe corrected, "because you needed a pair of eyes you could disavow. And Freddie, obligingly poor and perpetually half-informed, gave you cover." Carl's lips parted, but Wolfe went on. "You paid him to observe, not Delia, of course. That would have sounded sinister. Just the window, the hours, the movements. And when the arrangement grew less casual, when Freddie realized what he'd witnessed might be worth more than your retainer, you decided he'd become a liability." Carl didn't protest. He didn't blink, but Gloria did. And from the corner of my eye, I saw Emily Thorne go still, not defensive, but as if Wolfe's voice had begun to echo somewhere she had been trying not to hear. Wolfe shifted his gaze to Emily, slowly, like a weight being redistributed across an old foundation. He didn't raise his voice. He never does when it's the truth doing the lifting. "Miss Thorne," he said, "you were Delia Vance's colleague. You admired her, perhaps envied her. But more relevant, you were also Mr. LeBron's instrument." Emily drew breath, but said nothing. "You received instructions," Wolfe continued. "Unwritten, of course. Men like Mr. LeBron have exquisite instincts for plausible deniability." But the implication was clear. Delia had become inconvenient. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened. The right thumb twitched against the knuckle of the left. I'd seen that before. It meant the battle between silence and confession was nearly over. You had access to her desk, her pills. You adjusted them. The dosage, the timing, nothing instantly lethal, just enough to make her light-headed, erratic, a slow erosion. Emily said, "I didn't," and stopped. Wolfe lifted a brow. "You didn't kill her," he said. "I never claimed you did." And in that single line, the rope was yanked. I stepped forward and placed the object on Wolfe's desk, a small, elegant watch in a black case, clean, precise, still ticking. "This," I said, "was found in the back drawer of Janowitz's bench. Never logged, never shelved. He hadn't gotten to it yet, but it had been dropped off. By Gloria." Wolfe opened the case and tilted the watch gently. The hands pointed to 3:17. Not now, of course. The mechanism had been paused, but its internal record showed the time it stopped ticking, 3:17 p.m., 2 days prior. "Miss Vance," Wolfe said, "was at Janowitz's shop at the moment Marsh claimed she was at the window. This watch proves it. The gears are honest, even if the men are not." Gloria's face didn't change, but she exhaled, a sound like something unwound in her chest. Wolfe closed the case with care and let it rest on the blotter like a final punctuation mark. "Time," he said, "can lie, but machinery only fails when instructed to." Emily's voice was a whisper against the silence. "I didn't mean for her to fall." Her eyes had gone glassy, not from guilt alone, but from the weight of no longer holding it. I thought it would slow her down. Make her less focused. Carl said it would give her clarity, ironically, that she was overwrought. I never imagined. Wolfe cut her off, not with words, but with the faintest turn of his hand. It was enough. "You poisoned the pills," Wolfe said calmly. "Not with malice, but with obedience. You altered her equilibrium. You shook the ground beneath her." Emily nodded once, a gesture so small it was barely a movement at all. But someone else, Wolfe continued, gave her the final shove. Someone who was there, who stood beside her, watching her sway, and instead of helping, used the moment to end her. He turned back to Carl. You had the motive, you had the access, and you had Freddie Marsh to watch from afar, to lend you the illusion of distance. Carl said nothing, but the silence now belonged to Wolfe, and it was growing sharper by the second. Wolfe, though planted squarely in his chair like a monarch rooted to the throne by divine moss, had turned his attention to the architectural diagrams on his lap. The service stair, drawn in tight lines on a faded floor plan of Delia Vance's building, coiled up the rear of the structure like an afterthought, unmonitored, barely lit, and ideal for private arrivals. Not all entrances are meant for visitors, Wolfe murmured. Some are for intentions. He traced the stairwell with a thick index finger. Carl Lebron did not enter through the front that day. He entered here. No record, no witness, no resistance. I nodded. Freddie couldn't have seen him from his perch. The angle was blind. Wolfe grunted. Of course it was. He wasn't meant to. With that, the final route into Delia's life, and her death, snapped into place. Carl hadn't merely watched her fall from afar. He'd been behind her, closer than any alibi could stretch. And he had used the one entrance no one ever thought to guard, which meant we had one last corner to turn, and Wolfe, finally, was ready to take it. For days, Freddie Marsh's testimony had been the spine of suspicion. A woman at the window, still silent at 3:17, but Freddie, as it turned out, had been watching shadows, not people. She stood there, Wolfe said, but it was not Gloria Vance. Kramer gave a grunt from the corner. Then who? Wolfe raised a brow. Delia. There was a brief silence, not stunned, but strained. She was drugged, Wolfe continued, her equilibrium compromised, her senses dulled, but she managed to rise, perhaps to get air, or perhaps to escape. She stood at the open window, her posture matched her sister's enough for Freddie's imagination to finish the portrait. Carl said nothing. You saw her, Wolfe said, voice colder now. And instead of stopping her, you helped her finish the fall. And then, quietly, no one mistook Gloria. They mistook the moment. Carl still hadn't moved, which was fine. Wolfe had. Mr. Lebron, he said, was not present as a witness. He was not helplessly watching a tragedy unfold. He was, by then, a man who had already chosen to end a liability. He turned slightly toward Kramer. He found Delia upright, but wavering, the result of Emily's interference, a woman clinging to the edge of lucidity. Wolfe looked at Carl. You could have called to her, stepped back, waited, but you didn't, because she was alone, because she had seen too much, because you believed you could shape her end into an accident. Carl's mouth twitched, just once. You gave the final act, Wolfe said, in silence. No force, no struggle, just a nudge. A hand pressed lightly. Gravity did the rest. And though no one moved, the room felt closer, heavier, as if the truth had entered it and refused to leave. And Janowitz? Wolfe asked, rhetorical as always. He had Gloria's watch, logged though not written, time stamped internally by the mechanism. He realized what it proved. He found the ledger page missing and understood why. I watched Carl closely then. No movement, but the gaze flicked left. He was no threat until he understood that time, in this case, was truth. And then he became inconvenient. Wolfe pressed a finger to the table. So you silenced him. Quietly. Tea poisoned. A man alone in his shop. He didn't even get to finish his final entry. Carl did not blink, but Wolfe had already written his own. Freddie Marsh, Wolfe said, was more complicated. Half a fantasist, yes, but even fantasy has its limits. He began to suspect that what he saw wasn't Gloria. He wanted payment for silence, or leverage. He went from observer to participant. Wolfe tapped the arm of his chair, and that was fatal. You couldn't afford another voice rewriting the narrative. Carl's jaw flexed once. That was all. Wolfe's voice thinned. You bludgeoned him quickly, quietly, and left his body beside the very instrument that first betrayed your plan. It was a neat symmetry. Wolfe admired those even in murder. Carl finally spoke. You have no proof. His voice was level, cool, the voice of boardrooms, settlements, and silence. I have no signature, Wolfe agreed. No confession. But proof? I have a woman whose medication was altered, a man who was poisoned, a ledger that was torn, a photo that was doctored, and a witness whose timing collapsed under scrutiny. He leaned forward, just slightly. I have a clock, Mr. Lebron, and a crime built against it. Carl adjusted his cufflinks. All you have is a theory. Wolfe's reply was soft. No, sir. All you have is a hope. And then Wolfe closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in finality. The argument was over. What remained was only consequence. Kramer shifted in his chair. Wolfe opened his eyes. 3:10, he began. Delia stands at the window. Freddie sees her, believes it is Gloria. At 3:17, Gloria is across town, handing off a watch that marks its own time. At 3:25, the body is discovered. By 3:30, the lie begins. By 4 o'clock, the page from the ledger is gone. He turned his hand over like a card on green felt. At 4:05, Mr. Lebrun calls Emily, to say nothing, but not say it late. He let the timeline settle like dust. Time was never your tool, he said. It was your witness, and now it testifies. Kramer didn't speak for a full 30 seconds. Then he rose, took 2 steps toward Carl, and said simply, You're done. Carl, to his credit, stood without resistance. The smile was gone. The silk had frayed. Wolfe said nothing. He didn't gloat. He didn't rise, but his left eyebrow lifted half an inch, his version of applause and execution. And then, as I turned to follow them out, I saw Wolfe reach for his beer. At long last, the timeline had resolved. Gloria came in just after 4, wearing a dress the color of early dusk and a composure that hadn't survived the week intact. There was no drama in her step, no bright-eyed relief, no teary performance for the benefit of the man who had lifted the noose. She sat where Wolfe indicated with a brief nod. Fritz brought her a glass of water, and she accepted it with a hand that trembled once and corrected itself. I don't know what to say, she offered, which was fair. She wasn't the kind to fill silence with filler. Wolfe waved a hand, not with dismissal, but with that rare kind of magnanimity he keeps in a cabinet behind the orchids. You are under no obligation, he said, to explain your relief or your retreat. I recommend both. She smiled at that. Faint, real. Then opened her purse and placed the watch on Wolfe's desk. It's keeping time again, more or less. Wolfe glanced at it once. Less. I took it and turned it over in my hand. The back was polished, the crack invisible, unless you were looking for it. It ticked, yes, but slower than the world around it. So did she as she walked out. The watch stayed on Wolfe's desk after she left. He didn't touch it, but he didn't ignore it either. It lay there like a wounded truth. Elegant, precise, and misleading by just enough to matter. He tilted his head toward it eventually as if listening. Mechanical time, he said, is a convenience, not a certainty. I didn't respond. I was waiting for the second act. He obliged. We invest belief in instruments, not because they are flawless, but because we must. The moment they fail, we assign fault to the nearest human. I raised an eyebrow. You mean Freddie? I mean everyone, Wolfe said. Miss Vance, Mr. Marsh, Mr. Janowitz, you, me, all of us betrayed by 7 minutes, and each believing it was the other who lied. He looked away from the watch. Precision, Mr. Goodwin, is an illusion granted to us by gear and spring. Its failure is not sabotage, it is entropy. Nice word, I said. I did not intend it to be. And with that he leaned back, as if the philosophy had been sufficiently dispensed. I sat with the thing, the watch, long after Wolfe had gone back to pretending he was reading Seneca. It had a thin, tidy tick, just audible in the hush of the room. But it ran 8 minutes behind the wall clock and 7 behind the death that nearly wasn't. 7 minutes. A man had died, a woman had nearly been tried, another had watched a murder thinking he saw something else entirely. Because of 7 minutes, that's what held up the whole case. Not justice, not motive, not guilt, just the minor betrayal of a gear's tooth or a neglected winding. And if it hadn't broken, if Janowitz hadn't held on to it, or Freddie hadn't noted the time, or Wolfe hadn't asked why. I let the thought breathe a while, then killed it. The truth is, we all keep time with something flawed. Memory, loyalty, anger. Some run fast, some slow, but none are ever precisely in step. So yes, Gloria Vance was acquitted, the city would forget, the trial would vanish, the clock, for what it's worth, still ticked. Slow, quiet, wrong, like most of us. Kramer arrived with no warrant, no bark, no threat, just a 6-pack of domestic and a grunt for a greeting. I offered to take his coat, he said no. I offered to pour, he said yes. I offered sarcasm, he ignored it. He set the beer on Wolfe's desk like an apology made of barley and stubbornness. "I'm not saying you were right," he muttered. Wolfe tilted his head without rising. "Of course not." "I'm saying you weren't wrong." Wolfe accepted the bottle with a nod that might have passed for royal if you ignored the girth. Kramer stood a moment longer, then turned and left without another word. No toast, no handshake, no surrender. But Wolfe smiled faintly as he took a sip. I made a note to mark the date. It's not often you see a man tip his hat without removing it. By 6 o'clock, the brownstone had begun to breathe again. Fritz was in the kitchen orchestrating the resurrection of lamb with rosemary. Wolfe had returned to his orchids, speaking Latin to a stubborn Miltonia that refused to bloom. I sat at my desk, turning over the pages of my notes like they were old love letters from someone who'd stopped signing her name. It was the kind of evening we specialized in. No clangor, no alarms, just the return of the metronome. And yet something hovered. Not tension, not unease, just the faint residue of proximity to violence. It clings to the walls for a while before it's smoked out by civility. I let the quiet settle. Wolfe did too. Outside, the sun bowed down behind the buildings, and the city, for once, didn't object. It came with the mail tucked in between a dry-cleaning flyer and the gas bill. No envelope, just a glossy 4x6 snapshot of a woman standing at Delia's window. Only it wasn't Delia, it wasn't Gloria either. The face was sharper, hungrier. The eyes weren't uncertain, they were calculating. I stared at it for a long minute, then checked the timestamp in the corner, faint but legible. Same day, same hour, and in the bottom right corner, in red ballpoint ink, "She lives." I walked the length of the office slowly and handed it to Wolfe. He glanced at it. Then, without word or gesture, he picked up the brass lighter from his desk, flipped it open, and burned the photo until it curled into black. No comment, no inquiry, just smoke. I waited. He didn't speak. "Could have been a fake," I said. No answer. Could have been real. Still nothing. He looked at the ashes in the tray as though they were petals that had bloomed too late, then brushed them into the bin. There are some truths Wolfe will unearth at any cost, and some he buries without hesitation. This apparently had earned a quiet grave. Wolfe spoke at last. Not to me, not to the room, but into the air as if remarking to the universe itself. Some truths, Goodwin, arrive late, and some are best not arriving at all. I didn't ask which this one was. Instead, I opened the window just a crack. Let in the night. Let out the ash. And as the watch ticked, faintly, from the corner of the desk, I reminded myself, time doesn't always tell the truth. Sometimes it only tells you enough. Justice came, not with thunder, but with the quiet turn of a watch's gear, its rhythm slightly off, yet truthful enough to unmask a lie. In the end, it wasn't the telescope, the ledger, or even the fall that unraveled the web. It was time itself, mishandled, misread, and merciless. Some wore guilt like perfume, others tried to wash it clean. And Wolfe, unmoved as ever, merely watched the scales tip, never flinching, never missing the weight of one breathless minute. Do you think guilt lies in the act itself, or in the silence that follows? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.